Episode 5, The Love Fair of Fanfiction and Romance. Did you know fanfics were and still are dominated by women? Hold on to that thought. Hello, loves. Let's just put it out there. I love some good, nerdy content. There is a lot to celebrate about geek culture, the community, and revelry. That includes the rite of passage known as fanfiction. No lie, I am a former fanfiction author, and I still read fanfiction. Let me just kind of take it back a little bit to give you guys a little more context. Before copyright existed, there were examples of public stories that were retold, revised, or refashioned from other original sources, right? But since the development of intellectual property, seeing ownership of characters and stories, previous notions of public stories petered out. While fanfiction has been around for centuries in many forms, the forefather of modern fandom gained traction with a little television show called Star Trek. Fandom of the 60s and 70s centered around a specific series or a product, and fanfiction was the bleeding edge of nerdy pursuits. Nobody outside the circle of fandoms knew what fanfics even were. For the uninitiated who may be listening, I will define fanfic. Fanfiction, or fanfic, is original fiction based on characters, worlds, or events in copyrighted media, such as books, movies, TV shows, and video games. In its simplest form, it's an act of creation, a labor of love by fans. Even if the only thing being created is a terribly written story, the aim is to be read and enjoyed by other fans. A lot of fanfiction reads like badly edited romance novels. You know the ones. Coupled with the fact that anyone can publish fanfic without writing experience can mean readers have to wade through pages of lackluster stories. Early days of fanfiction stretch back to Star Trek fans, where many writers didn't discover fanfics until college. You see, back in the days before the internet, fanfiction got published in fanzines and made rounds at conventions. But the precedent set by the original Star Trek fics has served as a superstructure for everything that's followed. As one early fanfic writer states, the slow realization that my partner and I had managed to create something that had the weight of owning a readership was unnerving. While older online fanfic is dwarfed by what is readily available today, at the time it felt massive compared to photocopies passed between friends. Fanfiction largely existed in small pockets on the internet in the 90s, until larger domains like fanfiction.net and DeviantArt gained prominence in the early to mid-2000s. Fanfiction community has evolved over time through scale and being more accessible to the masses. Because current fandom culture is considerably less stigmatized and more widespread, the primary audience has become younger and is still predominantly female. Here's where that little breadcrumb of information I dropped at the beginning pays off. The fanfiction community has no restrictions or guidelines on its content, for better or worse. Fanfic writing is a free-for-all, allowing anonymity and equality among participants. Even the act of writing a fanfic functions like an incubator, storing ideas and actualizing them in a tangible form. As an added bonus, the community is mostly women, and usually very gay positive. Research found writing fanfiction allows young women to create empowering narratives, leading them to feel more powerful and in control of their everyday lives. Based on her ethnography of female fan communities and practices, Camille Bacon Smith concluded that female fans find great pleasure in creating a new kind of community that fulfills women's needs to reach out and be heard. The sense of community writers feel from participating in fan fiction is important, especially for impressionable teens who might otherwise feel excluded in their peer group. Fan fiction is a great tool for new authors. It's a way to hone writers' craft and encourage praise, criticism, and collaboration from others in real time. For many writers, like myself, the act of practicing fanfiction writing allows a safe way to make mistakes, find your writing voice, and learn the skill of storytelling until it becomes instinct. Plus, the characters are already built, so it's easy to focus on aspects like plot and style. On the flip side, the romance novel, another literary device consumed and produced by women, is defined as a central love story and an emotionally satisfying and optimistic ending. Romance novels typically follow two lovers struggling for a romantic relationship and being rewarded with a happily ever after. Arguments persist that romance novels and fan fictions are forms of fantasy fulfillment for their respective communities. Fan fiction, however, seeks to fulfill different fantasies than a romance novel, which distinguishes the two genres. Fanfiction and traditional romance provide different narratives. Analyzing fanfiction within the context of the romance novel further shows the distinction. And fanfiction fulfills fantasies different from romance novels, and thus do not fit the defined framework of the romance novel. A distinction between these two forms of written work is the fans' traditional comfort with the sexual content of their romance narratives. While romance novels have historically placed sexual encounters with a promise of an inevitable marriage or in a framework of marriage, fanfiction produces stories where sex may be enjoyed in all sorts of circumstances, and some sexual encounters can come without a larger relationship narrative. Sex in romance novels serve to connect and bond the hero and heroine together. Sex in romantic fan fiction is an exploration of self. The practice of fan fiction creates an environment in which women explore love and sexuality without conventional boundaries, taking the romance formula, breaking it down, and creating new forms of fantasy. Romance is commended for its focus on women's sexuality and pleasure, but fanfic also has a reputation of being sexy. And much of the sex is kinky or taboo or queer. It's also a tool to critique sources, using gender, race, religion, and class as ways to reimagine other contrasting or compelling stories. Romance novels value sexuality within the hero and heroine's relationship. Sexual fanfictions are not bound by the idea of a committed relationship. Rather, it is based on the heroine or hero's ability to explore their sexuality regardless of a romantic relationship. Francesca Coppa, a professor of literature and theater at Muhlenberg College, has compared the writing of fanfic to the restaging of Shakespeare's plays. Quick aside, as an actor who has gender bent in a Shakespeare play, I can attest to this personally. A change of gender, race, or sexuality, where applicable, can lend social context or additional depth to a role. Ramble is over. The diversity of sexuality and characters, rich mythos and world building, adaptability, and freedom of expression, all features of fanfiction, function as direct responses to the restrictions, traditions, and limitations found within the structure of many commercial romance novels. Romantic fanfictions vary greatly, and as such, the fantasies they address have range. Popular fanfiction sites like Archive of Our Own hold countless examples of fanfiction writers fulfilling fantasies other than the lover's struggle for a happily ever after. In contrast to romance novels, fanfiction stories follow the formula of a TV series by returning to worlds and characters over and over again through interconnected stories, series, or chapter length and duration. You know, the ones that are like 400 plus pages, but you eat up every word. It's good stuff. Writers use repetition to intensify the immersive experience, as opposed to telling the story of a couple once and then moving on. Fanfiction also continues to evolve, much like the self-publishing industry. By taking cues from promotional techniques used by traditional publishing to tease readers about stories. Fanfictions have begun to use cover images, blurbs, and taglines to identify story categories and details. While romance novel readers might use publisher imprints to distinguish the level of sexual explicitness or type of sexual content in a story, fanfiction is utilizing ratings and cover images to convey their message. Readers also tend to maintain collections or tracking methods for favorite fanfics, just as commercial romance readers keep and reread favorite stories or visit libraries and bookstores for more. These collections become virtual bookshelves and private libraries for rereading fanfiction stories online, with stories passed on and recommended just as romance novel readers borrow books from friends or check out the library. Without the limitation of the publishing industry, fanfic authors are able to engage in greater experimentation with story structure, character sexuality, and the types of relationships they present to readers. Some experimental subgenres have even leaked into the self-publishing world through the popularization of Amazon Kindle Publishing Direct, such as male pregnancy stories. The dominant narratives within fanfiction stories reveal an audience taking great pleasure in reading and building romantic and sexual stories. That being said, romance novels are still a solid go-to drug of choice for many readers. If you've been around the block a few times with romance novels, like me, you tend to notice that commercial romances follow a strict formula and are a highly controlled product. That's not a bad thing. Popular literature formats provide the reader with a comfortable structure and sense of stability. But this structure can then be used to expose the reader to new themes and ideas, which helps encourage diverse voices and new approaches. Romance novels continue to advance by exploring characters' lives beyond romantic struggles and help them discover their own power. This new wave of romance novels lead change with the majority of readers and experimentation within expressions of romance. The traditional romance genre has the tricky task of negotiating between two perspectives. It either uses structure, characters, and narrative to make sense of changes in the larger world, or change the world within the story in order to create a place of refuge and pleasure for the reader. In a collection of essays by romance authors, New York Times bestseller Jane Ann Krentz asserts that romance novels invert the power structure of a patriarchal society because they show women exerting enormous power over men. While sexual aspects or power struggles may be coded and hidden, commercial romance brings a level of pleasure and fulfillment to a primarily heterosexual female audience. While every romance novel is not created equal, each speaks to its readers and reconciles social change in its own way. That brings us to the topic of slash within fanfiction. You can't talk about fanfiction without mentioning the impact of slash. Similar to the romance genre, there is coding in how fanfics are written, and it isn't necessarily the literal love affair between characters, but love and sex as women view them and want them. While non-romantic fanfiction exists, romance-based stories, both gay and straight, dominate fandoms. There are 3 major categories of fan interest: heterosexual pairings, homosexual pairings, or slash, and general fiction. Romance lies at the heart of most of these stories. Star Trek fanzines played an influential role in the development of slash, a subgenre where 2 same-sex characters are paired in situations that are either romantic or sexual in nature. Most online fanfic archives maintain that Captain Kirk and Spock were the first widely circulated same-sex couple within the slash genre. Research found the impact of slash led some lesbian and queer girls to find role models in fanfiction, particularly important at a time where they felt alone, vulnerable, and unsupported. Slash became an outlet for converting aspects of modern culture or media that felt lacking in representation. Some writers even speculate that women writing male slash pairings specifically serves as a way for authors to have the freedom of being male in their female bodies, as another way fanfic challenges conventional gender relations. Focusing on slash is seen as a safety valve, a substitute for desires that could not be articulated, much less acted out, in our real world. If women want to imagine sex between people who are both empowered and equal, we may have to imagine 2 men. By exploring characters navigating relationships before, during, and after an HEA, fanfictions function beyond the definitive happily ever after. The fanfiction community of writers and readers are interested in relationships that aren't defined by a happy ending, but rather a happy life. There's more interest in how characters navigate life besides just a relationship, which ends up culminating with commitment in romance novels. These storylines don't align with the romance novel industry's value on happily ever after. Fanfic writers present readers with speculative and reflective questions about life in a way that garners attention from others. The story Francesca Coppa chose for her book, The Fanfiction Reader, centers on Buffy, the famed vampire slayer, contemplating the way her life should have been. If you're a Buffy fan, you might also want to read Buffy's ruminations and find more thematic depth and interest in her story. If the story were about original characters, an audience has fewer reasons to read and invest in the story, and fewer still to follow thought-provoking characters in a town or world that has been built from scratch. Fanfiction highlights a readership that is seeking more diversity and realism in storytelling techniques and in relationships. These evolutions are seen in the romance genre today, as the traditional publishing world is slowly broadening their scope of stories to include better representations of race, gender, sexuality, size, religion, and class. Many romance genre stories do end with the two protagonists moving to a new stage in their relationship and the implication of monogamy. In fanfiction stories, relationships and romance are commonly framed as works in progress, rather than something that is settled by the end of a story. In fanfiction, romance is one of the most popular story types, but conceptions of romance continue to expand, incorporating LGBTQ+ relationships, open relationships, greater sexual realism, and more diverse depictions of gender. This, in turn, influences past, present, and future fanfic readers to seek out stories with less restrictive norms and encourages authors to write and publish stories that challenge tradition and push creative boundaries. Simply put, fanfiction inspires people to write, whether nurturing a writing passion that has always existed or encouraging a fan who might not have otherwise written at all. Even if there are a lot of fics that couldn't be seen as progressive, lack of censorship and encouragement from an online community is part of what makes fanfiction writing such a great activity that feels both safe and fun, especially to young female writers. The act of writing fanfiction asks readers to invest in new or continued narratives with favorite fandoms, and lets authors know that they aren't alone in expressing innovative story ideas. I'd love to connect with you, and here's how. Find me on Twitter or Instagram at @romancethestory. References for this episode can be found in the show notes. Book recommendations for this episode: Fic, Why Fanfiction is Taking Over the World by Anne Jameson, and The Fanfiction Reader by Francesca Coppa.